On the morning of June 13th, 1996, Annie Dodge was raped and stabbed to death in an apartment in Idaho Falls. She was 18 years old and her body was found after she didn't show up for work. The city's police department investigated the killing, but the summer and fall came and went without an arrest. In 1997, Idaho Falls, Benjamin Hobbs was arrested on January 5th in Nevada and charged with sexual assault. Idaho Falls police began to interview Benjamin and his friends, trying to build a case against him. One friend was Christopher Tapp, who was 20 years old at the time. He and Benjamin were part of a group of young people called River Rats, who hung out by the trails along the Snake River not far from her apartment. Christopher was seen with Angie at a gathering the night before she died. He was interviewed first by Idaho police on January 7th and then released. He was interviewed again on the 10th and police scheduled another one for the following day. Before the third interview, his parents hired him an attorney, and Christopher didn't show up for the interview. The police went to his house, where his mother told them that her son would come to the station on January 13th with his attorney to answer any questions. Rather than wait, police returned with an arrest warrant and charged him with being an accessory to a felony. In the first interview, Christopher said neither he or Benjamin were involved in Angie's death and that he knew nothing about it. At the second interview, he said that Benjamin had killed Angie and asked him to provide an alibi. On January 15th, his story seemed to change again, and he said that he had been with Benjamin when he killed Angie. He said Benjamin was angry with her for trying to break up his marriage. During most of the interviews, a video recorder was running. In addition, Christopher's attorney watched on a monitor in a different room. One of the officers who questioned him was Jared Furman, who had been a school resource officer and was seen as a person Christopher trusted. On January 15th and 17th, Christopher entered into a series of immunity agreements with prosecutors. Under the terms of these agreements, he had to provide truthful information about the crime, and in return, he would only be charged with and allowed to plead guilty to aiding and abetting an aggravated battery. Christopher was interviewed again on January 18th, but there was an issue. The DNA test results had returned. They excluded both Benjamin and Christopher as a source of semen, which was found on her body and clothes. The police suggested a fix, offering up the idea that a friend of theirs named Jeremy Sargis was involved. Christopher changed his story yet again, and now said that Benjamin and Jeremy raped and killed Angie. On January 27th, the DNA results came back on Jeremy, and they were negative. Now at this point, neither of these three targeted are positively identified to the semen that was found. So why are the police continuing their manhunt? In addition, Jeremy's alibi checked out. Prosecutors were angry and they avoided Christopher's immunity agreement on January 29th because they said he was being untruthful. On that day, Christopher was taken to the crime scene. His attorney declined to go. At this point, Christopher changed his story again. He now said that he had held Angie down during the rape and stabbing. Benjamin was still there, but Jeremy was no longer there. He was replaced by a friend of Benjamin's named Mike, but Christopher didn't know him. On January 30th, Christopher took his 5th polygraph test. During the questioning, police told him that he could possibly get a more lenient sentence if he had been in fear of his life after witnessing such a crime on Angie. Christopher took the bait and said that he had cut across her breast, joining in on said assault because he felt threatened by Benjamin, who said he would kill him if he didn't do anything. The police told him that he had passed his test, but they would later note on his report that Christopher had been deceptive in his answers about participating in the crime. On February 3rd, Christopher was charged with first-degree murder, rape, and use of a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony, which was sentencing enhancement. Benjamin, although convicted of the Nevada assault, was never charged for Angie's death. Jeremy had been initially charged as an accessory, but they were dismissed. Christopher's trial in District Court for Idaho 7th Judicial District began on May 12, 1998. His attorney tried unsuccessfully to suppress the confession, arguing that it had been coerced, but Judge Ted Wood said that the vast majority of his statements to the police could be used against him. The confession tapes and police explanations of their contents took up much of the trial. In the first interviews with Christopher, it was clear that police were focused on Benjamin as the suspect and trying to get him to implicate his friend. They falsely told him that Benjamin had already placed him at the crime scene and that they could help him if he cooperated. Christopher said that he would help if he could, but he didn't know anything. He was just a scared little man. In later interviews, under pressure from detectives, his involvement would steadily start to increase, and he would eventually come to say that he had helped hold Angie down while Benjamin and the third man raped and stabbed her and then forced him to slash her right breast. During the interviews, he was threatened with the death penalty and was told that he couldn't remember what he had done because he had repressed the memories of his brutal actions. At trial, police officer Jared testified that he knew what Angie was wearing before he was shown crime scene photos. But a later examination of all the polygraphs and confession videos showed that he did not mention the clothing until after seeing the photos. With his confession, prosecutors introduced the testimony of a young woman named Destiny Osborne. She said she was at a party a few days after Angie was killed, and she overheard him and Benjamin talking about the crime. Destiny was high at the party and said that she heard Benjamin say he had killed Angie because she owed him money for drugs. That was contradicted by Christopher's statement to police, in which he said that Angie didn't do drugs. Christopher didn't testify, but witnesses provided an alibi. They said that he had spent the night with a woman and the date was clear because his girlfriend had caught them the next morning. But prosecutors presented other witnesses in his circle of acquaintances who said he had the dates wrong. The jury of 9 women and 3 men convicted him on all charges on May 28, 1998. He was sentenced later that year to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years for the murder conviction and 10 years for the rape conviction. Christopher fought his conviction through a series of appeals that were very challenging and among other things. The prosecutor's voiding of the immunity agreement, whether he had diminished mental capacity, and the effectiveness of his attorneys in suppressing his statements to the police. Each was rejected, although a 2001 opinion by the Idaho Court of Appeals said his Miranda rights had been violated during several of his interviews with police. However, they also said that these errors were harmless. The Idaho Innocence Project took on his case in 2007. The following year, they requested DNA testing on hairs recovered on Angie. The hairs originally had been visually inspected. While Idaho law at the time gave defendants only a year to request retesting of DNA evidence, the hair testing was done at the request of the police department. DNA testing performed at the regional laboratory showed that the DNA on the hair was consistent with the DNA of the semen and excluded Christopher. His legal team continued to push for further testing. During this time, his attorneys and the Idaho Innocence Project had pushed for additional testing of all evidence. A judge turned down their request in August 2012, writing, "While DNA testing may be relevant in identifying one of the assailants, such does not make it more probable that he is innocent." At the end of 2012, limited DNA testing was done of Angie's shirt and sweatpants and a teddy bear that was found with her body. Christopher and Benjamin were excluded as contributors. The Idaho Innocence Project then worked with the Idaho Falls Police Department to use forensic genealogy to determine the male lineage that matched the Y chromosome profile identified from the evidence. However, the first men tested who came from this lineage did not match the complete DNA evidence. Carol Dodge, Angie's mother, had initially pushed for Christopher to receive the death penalty, but as years passed without any other arrests, she began to have serious doubts about his guilt, and she became one of his strongest advocates to prove his innocence. In 2013, after viewing the videotapes of his confessions, she contacted Stephen Drizin, one of the nation's leading experts in false confessions and professor at Northwestern University's School of Law. Stephen had already been in communication with Christopher's legal team since 2012, and he agreed to investigate the case pro bono. The report he published in 2014 concluded that Christopher's confession was coerced, produced through deceit and pressure, and then enhanced by the officers supplying Christopher with sufficient details to lend credibility to his statements. Stephen helped recruit Innocence Project of New York to work on his case, and they joined the Idaho Innocence Project and Judges for Justice in an effort for Christopher's freedom. In May 2016, his attorneys, led by John Thomas of the Bonneville County Public Defender's Office, filed a motion for post-conviction relief. They asserted that his confession was a result of police coercion and deception, and that the videotapes of 3 of the 7 polygraphs showed that coercion and deception had been withheld from his trial team. In addition, the motion noted that his confession didn't fit with the evidence. He had told the officers that the crime took place about 1 a.m., but Angie had been with friends at about 12:30, and an autopsy showed her bladder was very full, indicating she had been asleep for some time. That motion would never be ruled on. On March 22, 2017, John reached an agreement with Bonneville County District Attorney Danny Clark. Christopher's rape conviction was vacated, and the sentence for his murder conviction was reduced to time served. He was released from prison. At the time, Danny said the deal made clear Christopher's involved in Angie's death. He said, "Anyone who says the evidence proves his innocence is operating from a biased agenda or his or her personal belief." After his release, the Idaho Falls Police began working with the Innocence Project and a technology company called Parabon Nanolabs in an effort to identify the source of the DNA sample. Once a genetic profile was created from the sample, they compared it with profiles submitted to genetic databases by people looking to identify relatives or discover their ancestry. Starting with profiles in the database, Parabon was able to use other records to build a family tree through the use of genetic genealogy. DNA samples were obtained from 6 people of interest generated from that tree, men who were roughly the right age and lived in or around Idaho Falls at the time of the murder. All were eliminated as the sources of the semen. This family profile had come up in an earlier DNA search, but not with the precision that Parabon was able to provide. Analysts learned that there was a 7th person of interest in that lineage, a man named Brian Drips. He had lived across the street from Angie and been questioned by police early in the investigation before the focus turned to Benjamin and Christopher. Brian now lived in Caldwell, on the other side of the state. The Idaho Falls police watched him, waiting for him to leave a recovered cigarette, which allowed Parabon to compare his DNA to the sample from the crime scene. Parabon reported that his DNA was the source of the sample. Brian was brought in for questioning, confessed, and was arrested on May 15, 2019 for murder and rape. He said he acted alone and did not know Christopher. On July 17, 2019, Christopher's murder conviction was vacated. It was believed to be the first time that genetic genealogy had been used to exonerate a defendant.